Hey, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. Today we are continuing the last Casualty, which is written by Philip Knightley, and we are on Chapter 6, Enter America, 1917 to 1918. Once lead these people into war, and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. President Woodrow Wilson on April 1st, 1917. The outbreak of war in 1914 had taken the American people by surprise. Their immediate reaction was one of revulsion and amazement, but they were quick to make their position clear. Historically reluctant to be drawn into Europe's troubles, they reaffirmed their neutrality, a neutrality, as President Wilson emphasized on August 19, 1914, in fact as well as in name. But it was felt, even at this early stage, that the war should be more than one of Europe's petty squabbles. General Nelson A. Miles saw it as becoming, quote, the world's most destructive conflict, end quote, and that the American public would want to be well informed of its progress. Carr Van Anda, editor of the New York Times, who was to arrange a coverage larger than any British newspapers, papered his office with maps, and the first wave of American war correspondents, who were eventually, to total 90, set out for Europe. There they joined all the other neutral correspondents, Swiss, Swedish, Danish, Dutch, Spanish, and South American, searching for ways to report the war. At first, the German side seemed to offer greater opportunities. The Germans were winning, and during a brief but fruitful period they allowed the neutral correspondents to go to the front, provided them with every facility, and allowed them to write virtually what they liked. As a result, neutral newspapers often carried vivid descriptions of battles days before the British and German censors released the news to their own people, and a Swedish correspondent, Sven Hedin, was able to write a long and comprehensive account of the early campaign. On the Austrian front, the neutral correspondents appear to have been given even better treatment. Billeted in a small Hungarian village, each assigned a batman, given free wine and cigarettes, dined lavishly, and promised early trips to the fighting areas, they took some time to realize that they were being fooled. The trips to the front seldom materialized, and when they did, the correspondents were allowed to see little of real interest. When William G. Shepard of the United Press arrived to assess the opportunities, he quickly decided that the correspondent had everything they wanted, except news. On the Russian front, Grand Duke Nicholas arranged for 2 railway cars to the neutral correspondents on a tour of the battlefields. But the war was not going well for the Russians, and after a rapid visit to the rear lines in Galicia, the party returned to headquarters with nothing of interest to report. The correspondents then moved to Warsaw, where they exchanged rumors and read the uninformative army communiques. The French treated neutral correspondents as they treated their own. If they were found near the front, they were seized. Luigi Barzini, after his early successful reporting, was deterred from even further excursions to the French front by being arrested and held in a stable for several days, receiving only such food as he could beg from his French guards. The British were almost as unhelpful. They had a system of conducted tours designed to show neutral correspondents everything except what the war was really like. There was also a nasty condition attached to being a neutral correspondent accredited to the British Army. If the correspondent later reported from the German side and was captured by the British, he would be summarily executed as a spy. The Germans eventually introduced similar strictures. They tended to a force of neutral correspondent to make... Come on, get on my lap, baby. There we go. Nadia wants to have a cameo and be part of it. Alright. Nice and comfy, honey. Alright. Get her on there too, since she wants to be part of it. Okay. So... If the correspondent later reported from the German side and was captured by the British, he would be summarily executed as a spy. The Germans eventually introduced similar strictures. This tended to force a neutral correspondent to make a commitment to one side for the duration of the war, and usually resulted in his being as fully absorbed into the propaganda machine as his British or German colleagues. So any early reporting successes that had neutral correspondents achieved soon became happy memories as the fighting settled into a stalemate and censorship molded the reporting of the war the way the military wanted it. The Americans fought hardest against this, and the history of their role in the First World War is one of long battle to report the war as they saw it, not as the British or the Germans or, later, the American censor wanted it. With courage that must be admired, some refused to compromise their professional integrity. They packed up and went home, forfeiting their accreditation rather than remain silent. In 1914, when Richard Harding Davis sailed on the Lusitania, he foresaw none of these problems. Davis, who occupied a $1,000 a day suite with his wife, was the most experienced and the most respected of American war correspondents. He was also the richest. His contract for reporting the war in Europe for the Wheeler Syndicate stipulated a salary of $32,000 a year and expenses, an immense sum in 1914. And one of the more pro-British, Davis went straight to Brussels, where he was when the first German forces entered the city. "I saw it in the first grand place in front of the Hotel de Ville," Davis wrote in his dispatch that night. "It was impossible to tell if it was that noble square that there was a regiment or a brigade. You only saw fog and melted into the stones, blended with the ancient house fronts that shifted and drifted, but left you nothing at which you could point. Later, as the army passed by my window, under the trees of Botanical Park, it merged and was lost against the green leaves. It is no exaggeration to say that at 100 yards you can see the horses on which the Uhlans ride, but you cannot see the men who ride them. Like a river of steel it flowed, gray and ghost-like." One morning, Davis hired a taxi and drove as far as Hull, where he was arrested and put under guard. After an hour, the sentry guarding him decided to rejoin his regiment. Davis took the road to Ath, where he was unknown to him. The British were making a stand. Caught up by a German detachment making a forced march in preparation for the surprise attack on the British right flank, he was compelled to trot with them for 5 hours, a punishing ordeal for a man his age, and then he was taken to divisional headquarters, searched and interrogated. The French found in his pockets a photograph showing him wearing a British military tunic complete with campaign ribbon, which he had copied from a uniform in the de Boer War. His American passport had been issued in London, not Washington. His laissez-passer from the French commandment in Brussels was not signed, only initialed. And, as he said afterwards, the cruelest blow of all. None of the Germans had ever heard of him or of his writings. The German officer said, "It is clear that you are a British officer out of uniform taken inside our lines. You know what that means." A summary court-martial consisting of 8 officers was convened and heard the evidence and postponed sentence overnight. At midnight, Davis was awakened and told of an impending British attack. If he agreed to head back to Brussels, 50 miles away along the main road, under the pain of immediate execution if he was found off the road or outside the city within the next 48 hours, he would be released. Davis accepted the terms and, limping from a bruised ankle, set out for the city. A few hours later, he hailed a German general's car heading for Brussels and talked his way into getting a lift. In 5 previous wars, he told the American ambassador, Brand Whitlock, that evening, he had never been so frightened. Davis lasted another year, then, disgusted at not being allowed by the British or French to visit the front lines, he returned home. "I'm not about to write sidelights," he said. He died, only aged 52, in 1916. Irving S. Cobb, war correspondent for the Saturday Evening Post, was a huge man and a prolific writer, had a similar experience and, like Davis, was saved because the Germans realized the propaganda value of remaining on good terms with American correspondents. Cobb, Harry Hansen of the Chicago Daily News, Roger Lewis of Associated Press, and 2 Chicago Tribune men, James O'Donnell Bennett and John T. McCutcheon, set out from Brussels to Waterloo, where a battle was said to be in progress. The Americans traveled in 2 horse-drawn cabs complete with top-hatted coachmen. But at Waterloo, there was no sign of either French or German forces. The Americans thereupon hired a pony trap and drove themselves into Beaumont, headquarters of the German Army Corps. They sought out an English-speaking colonel and presented their credentials. "But we have no correspondence with our forces," the colonel said. "You have now," said Cobb. The German was not convinced. The correspondence could have remained overnight, he said, but he would put on a train for Brussels that morning because it is not permitted to have correspondence within our armies. The next morning, the officers found that a British advance during the night had upset arrangements, and the train took them to a coachload of Allied prisoners at Aix-la-Chapelle. There, the German army hierarchy, alert to the opportunity for the Americans presented, offered to show them the German army machine. Cobb went up in an artillery spotter balloon, from which he inspected artillery batteries, and finally was taken to the fort at Liege, where he had been captured earlier. His escort exulted in the wreckage that the German 42-centimeter guns had caused and attempted to impress Cobb with details about them. Cobb, in his flowery but descriptive style, wrote in a dispatch, "Had I not already gathered some notion of the powers of destruction of these 1-ton, 4-foot-long shells, I should have said that the spot where we halted had been battered and crashed at for hours. Now, though, I was prepared to believe the German captain when he said that probably not more than 5 or 6 of the devil devices had struck this target. Conceive of each of the 6 as having been dammed by a hurricane and sired by an earthquake, as having been related to an active volcano on one side of the family and to a flaming meteor on the other. Conceive it as having fallen upon man-made, masonry-walled burrow in the earth, and being followed in rapid succession by 5 or 6 of its blood brethren, and then you will get some fashion of the mental photograph of the result." Cobb and his colleagues stayed with the German army for 2 weeks and were then put aboard a train for Paris. Cobb's other big story on this first tour was an interview with Kitchener. Kitchener's interviews were highly formal, questions had to be submitted in writing, and the correspondent attended later to hear the answers. No one told Cobb the most important condition. Kitchener was not to be quoted. Cobb's story in the Sunday Evening Post quoted him liberally, and Kitchener replied by denying point blank that he ever given the interview. Cobb enjoyed the brief sensation that all this caused, but realized he would find it impossible to operate under such strictures, and so he too packed up and went back to the United States. William G. Shepard was much more successful, mainly because of the ingenuity he and his office displayed in their battles with the British censor. Shepard had come over to join the agency's hard-pressed London bureau soon after the outbreak of the war, and got way to a splendid start by interviewing Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill was well aware of the benefits of a favorable press in the United States, dictated that he wanted what he wanted to say, and then later, after speaking with the King and the Prime Minister, Asquith, added new material. The story was a major news break, and British newspapers had the disappointment of having to use it under a United Press dateline 24 hours after it had appeared in America. Shepard was visiting GHQ at Saint-Omer on April 22, 1915, on a beautiful spring morning, when the Germans launched the first poison gas attack on the Western Front. They had tried gas earlier against the Russians, but the Russians had failed to report it to their allies. Shepard hurried to Ypres and arrived in time to see the casualties and describe their agonizing condition. This was one story the censor did not want to kill, and Shepard's flat, unemotional account of the incident weighed heavily against the Germans in its propaganda battle that was developing in the United States. But the scoop by which Shepard is best remembered is his account of the Zeppelin raid in London on September 8, 1915. Before the last bomb had fallen, and while the fires still raged, the censor issued a general prescription. Nothing was to be written about the attack. Shepard spent a few hours experimenting with his copy, and then filed a remarkable story. Though nothing could be written about the bombing itself, there was no ban on writing about the heroism of Londoners. These civilians, not privileged to fight at the front, had proved their mettle now that it had reached their home area. They had fought fires, rescued wounded, shrugged off an entirely new type of warfare, and patching together their houses and shops, had carried on as usual. The censor could find no reason to delete a word, and there was probably not a single U.S. press reader the next day who failed to get the message. The United Press also scored well in France and Germany. Karl H. von Wiegen, a German-speaking American who was representing the United Press in Berlin, wrote a story from Virbalin in Russian Poland on October 8, 1914, in which he gave the first description of the effort of concentration. German machine guns fire on closely packed troops. The Russians literally went down like dominoes in a row. Those who had kept their feet were hurled back as a terrible gust of wind, the withering fire raking them as they faltered. The lines broke. Panic ensued. The Germans liked Wiegen's portrayal of their armed might, and they rushed him to the Western Front to report on the German advance on Paris. On November 20th, he was given an interview with the officer commanding one of the attacking armies, Crown Prince Wilhelm. It was the first interview Wilhelm had given to a foreign war correspondent, and the first direct statement to the press by any member of the German royal family since the war had started. Wagon sent it by a courier who traveled via Namur, Aix-la-Chapelle, and The Hague to London, where it was cabled to the United Press to New York. It made the front page headlines in all UP newspapers in the United States. The Crown Prince pleaded the Germans' case in the same way that Churchill had pleaded Britain's case in his interview with Shepherd, and begged for understanding in America. Undoubtedly, this is the most stupid, senseless, and unnecessary war of modern times. It is a war not wanted by Germany, I can assure you, but it was forged on us, and the fact that we were so effectively prepared to defend ourselves is now being used as an argument to convince the world that we desire conflict. In Paris, William Sims, a United Press representative, refused to allow the German advance to disturb his daily ritual of morning coffee at the Café Venois on the Boulevard Montmartre. He was sitting there when a little German monoplane flew over the city at an altitude of less than 1,000 feet. It was so low that Sims could see the pilot quite clearly as he leaned over the side of the cockpit and hurled a bomb towards the ground. It fell in a courtyard across the boulevard from Sims, tore a hole in the ground, and shattered all the windows in the building. Sims hurried back to his office and wrote an eyewitness story of the first bombing raid ever to take place on a large city. But when he tried to join the French armies at the front, an officer tore up his credentials and said, "Get out, we don't want you," Sims wrote. The old-time war correspondent with freedom of movement passed out in the first month of the war. Nevertheless, the overall picture of the American newspaper reader perceived in the first months of the war was certainly better than that given in British, French, or German newspapers. It was a comprehensive coverage, and at first it was presented with reasonable impartiality. A poll had taken late in 1914, in which 367 newspaper proprietors were asked which side had their sympathy, and it is clear from reading the newspapers of the early war period that the editors were careful to preserve this neutrality in the selection and display of war news. The Los Angeles Examiner, for example, in its issue of September 23, 1914, carried an article written especially for it by Dr. Bernhard Dernberg, a former director of the German Colonial Office, a story by Ellis Ashmead Bartlett of the London Daily Telegraph, describing what he saw in Rheims under a German bombardment, and a dispatch by W.M. Duckworth of the International News Service and the London Daily News, dateline Copenhagen, where Duckworth monitored the Berlin papers, describing the Kaiser's visit to a German military hospital. Such was the desire at this time to maintain a neutral coverage that the New York Times took action to stop a rumor that it was partially controlled by the Times of London, and that Lord Northcliffe was dictating the New York Times policy. Come on, you little dork. What are you doing? You just came to sneeze for everybody? Alright, Nadia has tagged back in now and helped us lose our spot. Just a second. That Lord Northcliffe was dictating terms to the New York Times policy to make it a friendly toward Britain and hostile towards Germany. The New York Times publisher, who had one of his senior staff check the newspaper's reporting of the war, came to the conclusion that there was an anti-German slant to the paper. He never succeeded in pinning down exactly how this occurred, but he offered a suggestion. There were a number of pro-British editors on the staff of the paper, and at least one British citizen, Frederick T. Birchall. The anti-German slant to the paper came, it was reported to the publisher, quote, from a cumulative typographical effect, end quote. Pro-British stories had been getting big headlines and prominent positions, while pro-German stories had been buried on the back pages. The publisher took steps to correct this practice and restore the newspaper's reputation for impartiality. This desire for neutrality in reporting extended to most American war correspondents. They were less susceptible to atrocity stories, no matter from which side they emanated. While British and French newspaper readers were being fed with accounts of German atrocities in Belgium, American readers were presented with a declaration signed by the same 5 influential American correspondents who had persuaded the Germans to allow them to accompany their army for 2 weeks. The declaration said that, from what the correspondents had been able to observe, the atrocity stories were untrue. None of the correspondents ever retracted this statement, and Cobb later offered it as his considered opinion that only about 10% of the atrocity stories were genuine. And the Associated Press correspondent on the German front in Belgium, Dr. Hendrik Wilhelm van Leeuwen, arrived in New York in January 1915 after the Germans had expelled him, and said the atrocity reports were, quote, indecent lies, end quote. William Shepard, the United Press man, wrote in 1917 that he had spent a considerable amount of time in Belgium in late 1914 trying to find an authenticated atrocity story, and had failed to do so. Donald Thompson, an American photographer working for London Daily Mail and the New York World, was promised handsome payment for photographs of a German atrocity, but was unable to find a single one. The New York World of January 27, 1915, quoted a State Department report which said that of the thousands of Belgian refugees in Britain, not one had been subjected to atrocities by German soldiers. But the stalemate on the Western Front made the Allies realize that they were in for a long war, and that the drain on their resources might be so great that they would require help from the United States to finish Germany off. The British Propaganda Bureau, financed from the Secret Services funds, had an American section headed by the popular novelist Sir Gilbert Parker, a Canadian by birth, who had been a British MP since 1900. Parker had spent the early months of the war analyzing the American press and deciding on ways of influencing it. Then he compiled a mailing list of Americans likely to be able to sway the public opinion, and he used this as a basis for a propaganda campaign. Under Parker's direction, British efforts to bring the United States into the war on the Allied side penetrated every phase of American life, from the pulpit to the classroom, from the factory to the office. It was one of the major propaganda efforts in history, and it was conducted so well and so secretly that little about it emerged until the eve of the Second World War, and the full story is yet to be told. Parker's success turned on the attitude of American newspapers, which then constituted the sole reading material of 90% of the American people. Relations between the American and the British press had always been good, particularly since American newspapers relied to a large extent on their news from Europe on London-based correspondents that either tended to be British nationality or had lived so long in London that they tended to be pro-British in outlook. At Wellington House, the headquarters of Masterman's propaganda bureau, every effort was made to win these correspondents over to the British cause. Wickham Steed, the foreign editor of the Times of London, held regular meetings with them and explained the British view of the war. Frederick Palmer, representing all three American news agencies, became the one non-British war correspondent in the original group accredited by the British Extraordinary Force in France. Other American correspondents were taken on conducted tours of the front, chaperoned by attentive and diplomatic officers. They were then wined and dined at the headquarters chateau and quietly briefed about the British case. The influencing of correspondence of the caliber of Palmer was done subtly, yet with marked success. Palmer apparently did not see through it until after the war, when he admitted that British propaganda had much to do with bringing the United Nations into the war, and yet confessed that he himself had written propaganda and the illusion of the moment. The almost complete capture of the American correspondence in this way ensured that American newspapers, the war would be seen as though through British eyes. Through his secret American Press Review, Sir Gilbert Parker was regularly able to report to the cabinet on his success, as witnessed to the issue of October 11, 1916. This week supplies satisfactory evidence of the permeation of the American press by British influence. The wisdom of Parker's campaign to win American support for the Allies became strikingly evident in 1917. In that year, Russia dropped out of the war. Italy suffered her overwhelming defeat at Caporetto, and England was within 6 weeks of starvation. There were mutinies in the French army, and Bolo Pasha, a Turk who dealt in pacifist intrigue, was arrested in Paris and later executed for using 10 million francs given to him by the Germans to try to persuade the French press to advocate an early peace. France was virtually finished, and the government, it was said, had secretly fixed November 1st, 1917 as France's last day if the United States had not entered the war by then. When, on April 6, 1917, America did enter the war, there were a number of factors that appeared to have caused the decision. There was the sinking of the liner Lusitania on May 7, 1915, which had been carefully fostered into an anti-American act. British and American babies murdered by the Kaiser, said the Daily Mail on May 10th. There was the German decision to go ahead with unrestricted submarine warfare from February 1st, 1917, and it was nearly successful. In the first month, German submarines sank 781,000 tons of shipping, and all that was needed at a rate was a rate of 600,000 tons a month to be fatal to Britain. And finally, there was the Zimmermann telegram, a message from Arthur Zimmermann, head of the German Foreign Office, to German Minister Mexico, instructing him to propose an alliance if the United States entered the war, and offer, if this occurred, German support for Mexico to regain New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. But it is suggested here that these events were only products of the policy under which the United States had gradually surrendered its neutrality by giving the Allies its material, financial, and moral support, and that this policy was in turn the result of Britain's propaganda campaign under the influence of what they had read in the newspapers. Americans came to regard the war as a simple battle between good and evil, And despite the fact that the 1916 presidential election showed that the great majority of the people wanted the United States neutrality to be maintained, there developed in the minds of America's leaders such a blind hatred of everything German that war became inevitable. Even when war had been declared, the American people showed a marked reluctance to take up arms. Enlistments were so poor. In the first 6 weeks, only 73,000 men volunteered, that it became necessary for the government to raise a conscript army. To inspire the nation to fight, a new homegrown propaganda campaign was needed in order to whip up what President Wilson's private secretary, Joseph Tumulty, called, quote, the people's righteous wrath, end quote. To this end, President Wilson set up, on April 14th, a committee on public information under the chairmanship of journalist George Creel, which was financed to the extent of $5 million from a $100 million fund guaranteed to the president for the general defense of the country. Its aims were helped by Lord Northcliffe, owner of the Times and the Daily Mail, and a member of the advisory committee to the Department of Information, who headed a mission to America and established the British Bureau of Information in New York. The mission took over Parker's work. He had resigned on grounds of ill health in February 1917, as soon as it was clear that America was going to enter the war, and at its strongest had 500 officials with 10,000 assistants working in the United States. Hatred of the Germans was now whipped to fever pitch. All the propaganda stories that had worked best in Europe were revived. Germany's sole responsibility, the rape of Belgium, the outraging of nuns, the unmentionable atrocities, the criminal Kaiser. News stories were created. One, a book called Christine by Alice Cholmondeley, a collection of letters purporting to have been written by a music student in Germany to her mother in Britain until her death in Stuttgart on August 8, 1914, mingled a damning catalogue of German character faults with emotional gush about music and filial feeling. The book had a wide circulation, and the Germans rated it as perhaps the best individual piece of propaganda during the war. The Creel Committee sponsored 75,000 speakers who, in some 750,000 four-minute speeches in 5,000 American cities and towns, aroused the righteous wrath of the people against the Hun and the Boche. It sent Lowell Thomas, the author and traveler, to gather stirring stories in Europe to stimulate more enthusiasm. Thomas soon realized that what he saw on the Western Front was hardly likely to bring recruits flocking to the American army, and so he went instead to the Middle East, where he met T.E. Lawrence, who was with the Arabs fighting the Turks. The romanticized dispatches Thomas produced about Lawrence of Arabia not only became brilliant propaganda, but also grew into one of the most endearing myths of the war, turning Lawrence into a national hero, and Thomas, the American who made my vulgar reputation, well-intended, intensely crude and pushful fellow, into a millionaire, as quoted by T.E. Lawrence. The influence of this barrage of propaganda on the American public cannot be overemphasized. The war historian J.F.C. Fuller writes of a, quote, propaganda-demented people, end quote, and says flatly that there can be little doubt that President Wilson would have remained neutral, quote, had it not been for the octopus of propaganda whose tentacles gripped him like a vice, end quote. Raymond B. Fosdick, in an article titled, quote, America at War, end quote, summarized the ecstasy of hate that gripped American people. We hated with a common hate that was exhilarating. The writer of this review remembers attending a great meeting in New England held under the auspices of a Christian church, God save the mark. A speaker demanded that the Kaiser, when captured, be boiled in oil, and the entire audience stood on chairs to scream in hysterical approval. This was the mood we were in. This was the kind of madness that had seized us. Those who did not accept the need for America to go to war, or who felt she could best contribute by using her influence for a negotiated armistice, were shot down, and the nation united to defeat Germany. In these circumstances, American war correspondents faced an almost impossible task. The Constitution granted the freedom of the press. The public was hungry for news. There was no censorship within the United States, and as one congressman put it, there is no public opinion in the world which ought to be so well informed with regard to the causes of the war, or the incidents of this war, or the principles of this war, as the opinion of the USA. But the principles of a nation at war demanded control not only of the way people thought, but also of the way that they thought. Such influential opinion makers as war correspondents could not be allowed to write freely, lest they create unproductive reactions, and so the whole apparatus of censorship at the front and the control and manipulation of news that had crippled the British war correspondent was now reproduced for his American colleagues. The rules for accreditation of a war correspondent to the American Expeditionary Force have to be read to be believed. First, the correspondent had to appear personally before the Secretary of War or his authorized representative and swear that he would, quote, convey the truth to the people of the United States, end quote, but refrain from disclosing facts that might aid the enemy. Then he had to write, and the authorities defined write to mean with a pen, not a typewriter, an autobiographical sketch, which had to include an account of his work, his experience, his character, and his health. He had to say what he planned to do when he reached Europe and where he planned to go. Then he or his paper had to pay $1,000 to the Army to cover his equipment and maintenance, and post a $10,000 bond to ensure that he would comport himself as a gentleman of the press. If he were sent back for the infraction of the rules, the $10,000 would be forfeited and given to charity. He was allowed to take an assistant for a further $500 maintenance fee, and if he did not wish to use Army transport, he could buy a car or ship one overseas for his personal use. Correspondents wore no uniforms, but were obliged to wear a green armband with a large red C. Frederick Palmer, who had been the only American war correspondent accredited to the British Army, where, because of his pro-British dispatches, he had been treated better than any British correspondent, was commissioned to organize the direct the American correspondence as part of Colonel Dennis E. Nolan's staff at G2 Intelligence. Palmer, who was a personal friend of the Commander-in-Chief of the American forces, General Pershing, had turned down an offer of $40,000 a year to cover the American force in the New York Herald Syndicate, and instead had signed on with Pershing as a major at $2,400 a year, plus allowances. Palmer was a highly experienced war correspondent. He had covered the Greco-Turkish clash, the Boxer Rebellion, the Moro insurrection in the Philippines, the Russo-Japanese War, and Pershing's expedition against the Pancho Villa in Mexico. He had been impressed by his experiences with the British Army in France and by its method of controlling correspondence. He now made the mistake of trying to impose the same restrictions on his American colleagues, a very different group altogether. They were flamboyant, energetic news seekers whose very presence seemed to attract trouble. Floyd Gibbons of the Chicago Tribune sailed for Europe in February, a few days after the severance of diplomatic relations between the United States and Germany, deliberately choosing the Laconia, an 18,000-ton Cunard liner because he reasoned she would attract German submarines. Gibbons was absolutely right. The Laconia was torpedoed off Southern Island at 10:55 p.m. on February 25, 1917, and sank 20 minutes later. Gibbons had his first big story. He took to a lifeboat where the other passengers, including a French-Polish actress with the amazing name of Titsy Siklosi, described him later as appearing, quote, cheerful and busy, end quote. He passed out cigarettes, offered to help the crew with the oars, and kept a lookout for swimmers. Early next morning, Gibbons was landed at Queenstown, soaking wet, half paralyzed with cold, and eyes bloodshot from the wind and lack of sleep. He quickly got a cable off to the Tribune, saying where he was and what had happened, and asking for 2 hours to thaw out and get his story down. He began typing almost immediately and wrote one of the most vivid, arresting, and detailed dispatches of the war. He had not only managed to produce an early casualty list that varied little from the final one, but he also interviewed many survivors, including a member of Lifeboat 3, who gave Gibbons the facts for this intriguing exchange. As the boat's crew steadied its head to the wind, a black hulk, glistening wet and standing about 8 feet above the surface of the water, approached slowly and came to a stop alongside the boat, not 6 feet from the side of it. "What ship was that?" The correct words in throaty English with a German accent came from a dark hall. According